Hello, it's Friday. I'm really early today. It's only 10:20 here in Nova Scotia. A lot earlier than usual, but it's just the place where I can fit it into my day. So I have a full day today. So I'm just going to fit my devotional in right now. Hopefully, those that watch it will still be able to connect with it later on, or however that works for you. But we're going to do that. So we're looking at Proverbs. I'm going to do that today. I got an interesting one today, and I'm going to deviate a little bit from my normal template to do this one today. We're looking at Proverbs chapter 3, verse 18. Now we've been working our way through Proverbs, of course, one verse at a time. And in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 13 to 18, there's a set of ideas here that all are all explaining and furthering the idea of what verse 13 says. And this is the last one on that line, and then verse 19 goes a slightly different road. But we're gonna look at verse 18 today, and in order to understand it, I'm going to read verse 13 because that's where it comes out of. So Proverbs chapter 3, verse 13 says, "How blessed is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding." And so then it goes in the next few verses and gives further idea to this statement until it gets finally to verse 18, which is the one we're going to do today. But just that verse 13, how blessed is the man who finds wisdom and the man who gains understanding. That's saying a person who finds wisdom, true wisdom, God's wisdom, a person who finds that person's life is better than the one who does not, right? Blessed. It's a blessed life. It's a life that's better than the one who doesn't. A person who does not find God's wisdom has a much less good life, much less happy life, much less full life, much less of life. And so that's the idea of verse 13. And so then each of the ones after that talk about the different aspects, about the wealth and about desire and all these things that they just don't compare to wisdom. And then we get to verse 18, which is today's verse, and it says, referring to wisdom as in the personification of wisdom as she, it says, "She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who hold her fast." So, there's much of the Proverbs and Psalms are very poetic, and so there's this poetic imagery of this woman that you take hold of this woman. You can imagine embracing this woman, and the one who takes hold and holds her fast. The benefit of that, it's like she's a tree of life, and everyone who does this is happy, blessed, happy. And so this idea here, and what I want to focus on today, well, I'm going to do a little bit of a different approach than most days. I do 4 questions. Today I'm not going to. I'm going to do a little different. Is because of this reference. She is a tree of life. And so the idea of a tree of life, it's a little bit of it's not a little bit, it's a lot. It's a direct link back to the creation story. And so there's a definite link meant here between the ideas, like this story of the tree of life. And so I'm going to tell you that story and show you why the link exists. But the question, I guess, if there was a question to be added today, is in your own life, do you sacrifice your life because of this desire to reject God's wisdom? That's kind of the thing out of this, because a person who does that, they don't just lose out on the wisdom of God, they lose out on life itself. And so that's kind of the idea here, is that if you embrace God's wisdom, you have life and life more abundant. But what about this idea of the tree of life? So the way the story goes, the way that it was given to us in the book of Genesis, the first book, usually if you get a Bible, it's usually the one they put right at the beginning as you open it up, and the first one you'll read, Genesis. It's a book of beginnings. It tells about the history of humanity and the start of everything, the start of sin and all those things. So it tells this story about Adam and Eve, who were the first 2 humans God ever created, this couple, and he created them and he placed them in this beautiful garden that he had made the world. He had made the whole world, and the world was good, and everything was filled with all these, all the creatures and the trees and all the things. But he made one spot in the world that was even nicer, which was this garden, and he planted it and created this ideal place. And he put Adam and Eve, and when he created them, he put them in the middle of the garden, he put them in there. And he told them, like, this is your home. But he gives them a number of things. And one of the things he gives them is this mandate to live in the world and be fruitful, multiply, grow, become a whole people, not just two, become a whole race of people, a whole species of people. So there's this mandate and there's all that, and it's a really neat story. In the third chapter of Genesis, the story talks about how they ended up rejecting God and why death came into the world and how it destroyed us. So that's the story. And so, of course, when he put them in the garden, there was in the garden this tree called the tree of life. And if they were eating of the tree of life, then they would live forever. And it was very clear that this is it. This is your gift from God. Eat from this tree. You can eat from all the trees, but there's this tree of life. And the tree of life is something, if you eat from it, you will live. And it's eternally. You'll never die. But if you sin, if you violate God's law, then the warning was given. If you violate God's law, you will die. You will be separated from the tree of life. You won't get to have it anymore, and then you will die. And so they were warned with this. So in the third chapter of the book of Genesis, the story of how they came, what happened, that they came about rejecting God and his wisdom and all that he is, rejecting God, and instead embracing something else, and how they lost access to the tree of life. And so humans to this day die. Death entered the world. What happened was the serpent, or Satan came in the form of a serpent, and he tempted them, and he told them that they could eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is another tree that God had put in it. He said, you can eat this tree, eat from this tree, eat the fruit of this tree, and you can become like God. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a tree that God put in the garden, and he told them not to eat of that tree. They were allowed to eat of any of the other trees. They could have apples and oranges and pears, and they could eat from the tree of life, but they weren't allowed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that was a rule. Now, for another day, we can talk about why God made that rule, but it was really the only restriction they had. It was a pretty easy thing, really. Just don't eat this one tree. And so that was the rule, and they weren't to do it. And he warned them, if you eat that tree, then you die. And Satan comes along and says, God doesn't want you to eat from this tree. And he tricks them. He says to them, the only reason God doesn't want you to eat from that tree is because he doesn't want you to be like him. He knows if you eat from that tree, you'll become like him, knowing good and evil. That's very key to what we're talking about here today. You'll become like God, knowing good and evil. And so Eve listened to the serpent. So the serpent was there deceiving her. And Eve listens to the serpent. She ends up eating the fruit, gives them to Adam. Adam eats the fruit. And then the whole story, if you're familiar with it, the whole story goes on. God shows up, judges, and humans are cast out of the garden, and we lose access to the tree of life. Well, here we are in Proverbs, and he's saying that we learn how blessed is the man's life who finds wisdom and gains understanding, right? That it's like she will be like a tree of life to the one who grasps her, who clings to her. A tree of life. So it's a direct link to that story. So that story is interesting because it kind of is the story, and why wisdom is so important for us all. It's kind of the story of all of us. It is the story of humanity, that God makes us to be wise people. Now, if you read the story in Genesis, you might not catch that right away. You may look at that story and go, well, he just made them to, be fruitful and multiply, to live in the garden. But he actually made them to be wise. So here's the thing. He creates Adam and Eve in his own image, right? He creates them to be his kids, to be like him. And so there's a very clear indication here that God's intention was that they would grow in wisdom. We can go to the New Testament. You can look at the Gospel of Luke, where the genealogy of Jesus goes right back to Adam, and it goes back, the son of, and it gets to Adam, and it says the Son of God. It calls Adam the Son of God. There's a number of places in Scripture that make this reference as Adam being like a son of God, like someone God made to be like him, to grow to be like him. It was God's intention from the beginning that being made in the image of God, we would grow in wisdom. There's some evidence of this and other things. In the garden story, Adam was told that he was to categorize all the animals. God brought them and said, you name them. And it's your job to figure out what is this animal. And see, the idea of giving a name to something was identify what it is, what it does, how it works in the world. So God brought the animals to Adam, and Adam looks at the various animals and he names them, he categorizes them, he identifies what they are. There's a wisdom growing there, and whatever it says, whatever he named them, that's what it was. And so there was this job given, this idea of growing in knowledge and understanding, and that was demonstrated through Adam's naming of the animals, for instance. So made in his image, that thing, and then there was a whole idea of dominate the earth. Like God says, be fruitful, multiply, dominate the earth, subdue it. Adam and Eve were given the job of cultivating the garden, causing it to grow. So there was once again an idea implicit in that of grow in wisdom, become more knowledgeable, become more understanding. And the only restriction placed on them is not for you to decide what good and evil are, right? So don't touch that tree. All the other trees, all the other stuff, the world is yours. Go out into it, subdue it, grow in wisdom. But remember, where does the knowledge of good and evil sit? Who gets to decide what is good and what is not good? God does. That's where it goes. That's where the moral center is, God. So he says, no, that's not for you. Now, would he have someday allowed them to eat of it or not? That's an interesting question for another day. But at that point, at least, no. So the story goes on. The serpent comes and says, and it's interesting because the first verse of chapter 3 of Genesis says the serpent was more crafty than any other animal. Not wise, crafty. He had a shrewdness. It was what the world might call wisdom, right? The ability to see how to manipulate and how to change someone's mind, to deceive someone, right? Very crafty. It's not wisdom, but often the world will call it wisdom. So we have the serpent who comes in, he's crafty, and he comes to Eve and he says, you can be like God. You can know good and evil. You can have the moral center. You can be it. And Eve looks at it and says she looked at the tree when she had listened to the serpent. She had a conversation. She looked at the tree and she thought, yeah, it looks good to eat and it's desirable to make one. And then the word is wise, to make one wise. And she wanted to be wise like God. It's interesting because, as I've been saying throughout the book of Proverbs, as we've been studying this, in the Bible, wisdom is not merely shrewdness like the serpent had. It's not just the ability to see how things work. It is moral. There is a moral aspect to wisdom. Anyone who tries to separate out the morality from the shrewdness ends up with just the serpent. You end up with evil. You end up with someone who may be shrewd, but not truly wise, because there's an evil there. You have to have the two together, the morality of God. So Eve tries to separate that out. She's like, oh, this would be great. I can replace God. I can have the knowledge of good and evil. And her wisdom would grow, and she thought her moral character could be centered in herself, and so on. This is the idea. And this is the idea that caused the fall of humanity, and the idea that we have and struggle with in the world to this day. We have the world thinking that wisdom comes from the creation rather than the creator. That we can grow in not just mental understanding, but we can grow even in moral character by looking to nature rather than to God, the creator of nature. And we think that we can draw that into ourselves, and we can become a moral code to ourselves. And we think we can separate out the true wisdom from the moralness of God. And we make that same mistake Adam and Eve made. And we make it over and over again, generation to generation. We keep thinking that somehow we can separate out the moral code from wisdom. And we call ourselves wise. It's just what the serpent, same craftiness that the serpent had. We try to adopt his approach, and it results in the destruction and the death and all the horrible things and the unhappiness that the world has experienced for all these many millennia. There's another implication there. Satan tries to convince us that we can separate that. We can become the moral center of our own wisdom. And then he also tries to convince us that God is trying to keep us from that. Right? And you've seen this. You've seen it in the world. Part of Satan's trap is to convince humans that God is actually a bad force trying to keep you from wisdom, trying to keep you from being able to know good and evil, rather than being the one who defines it and shows it to you. He tries to convince you that he's actually the villain. And the world does this all the time, and they act as though God's law and God's word and the scriptures are these antiquated, old, and we'll even say evil things, right? And we try and turn it around, and we think, a lot of people in the world today think they're being wise by rejecting the ancient true wisdom and moral code of the Bible, of the scriptures. It's Satan's trap. It's the same one he did from the very, very beginning. We get this idea that somehow you can be the source of your own moral code. And then we get the idea that we can be the source of our own wisdom, our own shrewdness as well. And it just doesn't work. That's the story of Adam and Eve. It's not just a story of the fall from relationship with God. It's also a story of the fall from the image of God. We as humans are still made in his image, but we've tarnished it. And the wisdom and the moral code that comes with it is tarnished in us. It's not as it should be in us. And so we have this problem. And so Proverbs calls us and says, come back to wisdom, God's wisdom. Come back to that proper wisdom. And the person who does that and finds her and clings to her, right, that wisdom that God gave us, well, then you will live a happier life, and you will, in fact, find that it's like a tree of life. You have it's in a sense, you've rediscovered the tree of life. You found it. Now, we still die and all that stuff because we live in this broken world. But that's part of getting to the place where we can be free from this broken world. But that's for another day. For today, life and happiness come from those that find God's wisdom, not the serpent's mutilated version of it. Right? Bless you. Have a good day. Hopefully that gives you something to think about. A little different approach today. But we'll go back to our 4-question format next week on Tuesday, or whenever I get into the office next, probably Tuesday. God bless. Have a great day.